Sawadee Krap everyone, this is Krunil. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about native speaker teachers versus non-native speaker teachers. And that means, should your teacher be somebody who grew up speaking English, or should it be someone who has grown up speaking another language and learned to speak English? Now, the English teaching industry would have you think that anybody who's a native speaker is automatically a better teacher of English than someone who is not. However, many native speakers, as witnessed when you see their posts on Facebook and social media, do not speak or write English very well. That is, they make frequent mistakes. Native speakers also often have accents that can be difficult for people in the international setting to understand. I myself spent a year in Scotland, and that's by no means the only example of this, but every single area of the English-speaking world has its own accent. And some of them are more easy to understand than others. The English that people are used to hearing, they're used to hearing because of Hollywood or because of the BBC. And so in England you have a BBC English accent, and in the United States, in Hollywood, you sort of go for mainstream, right? It's sort of a neutral kind of accent. If you deal with people who have more pronounced regional or ethnic accents in the United States or other countries, then in the international setting, even though they're native speakers, they're very hard to understand. And in one example, I knew a Scottish teacher who was teaching in Japan, and the other native speaker teachers who were there were actually from the United States, and they couldn't understand what the Scottish teacher was saying. So native speakers, the accent is no guarantee. The mastery of the English language is no guarantee. What is a guarantee is that they have sort of a very natural relationship to the language. When you're dealing with non-native speaker teachers, a big problem is that in countries where English teaching is not that great, and perhaps you do not have that many people vying for the position of English teacher, you have non-native speaker English teachers who aren't very good at English. And if you're not very good at English, then maybe you shouldn't teach it, because you cannot provide an example for your students. That said, it's not your nationality that disqualifies you, it's your mastery of the English language. Myself, as many of you may know, I'm a native speaker of English who's also had to study English as a foreign language, besides doing the master's degree, of course. But even before then, I had studied English as a foreign language, even though I already knew the language. And I did this in Sweden, which is the country, together with the Netherlands, in the world where people who are not native speakers speak English the best, year after year. And granted, part of the reason for that is that English, because of all the Viking invasions, derives in large part from the Scandinavian languages, be it Danish or Swedish or Old Norse, really. And so there's a lot of crossover from Swedish to English, just like there is actually from Dutch to English. And English, of course, is a Germanic language. So someone who speaks Thai has a bigger step to make, and it's not really a fair competition. But what is fair to say is that the teachers who teach English to Swedish children, and from what I hear, Dutch children, are often from the student's own country. That is, they are native speakers of Swedish or Dutch, and they teach English as a foreign language just as they themselves learned it as a foreign language. And quite often in the classrooms, they will use tools like translation and strict grammar teaching. I myself, when learning how to speak French and Spanish, studied grammar, and I studied translation. Instead of playing word games to get like a word across to the students, the teacher would give us a list, or we'd have a text that had a glossary attached, and we would memorize the words. Now, some would say rote memorization has no place in language learning, but it does. Especially it has a very big place in the most basic building block of language learning, which is vocabulary. For instance, also when learning Thai, foreigners might use memorization to memorize the alphabet, or to memorize the rules of tonality and things like that. This is not a waste of time. And if you don't have those rules, then mastering the target language is a lot more difficult. And so any teachers who tells you that I teach conversation, I don't teach grammar, because grammar is only for books, is deluded. They don't know what they're talking about. Anytime you teach anybody a system of communication, you are teaching grammar. If you're teaching them to mimic exactly what you do and say exactly what you say, then maybe you're not teaching grammar. But if you're teaching them any kind of rules for saying I am instead of I is, then that is implicitly grammar, whether you use grammatical terminology to explain why or not. Now, at the University of Edinburgh, where I studied, I realized that, first of all, there's not really any good science underlying the recommendations for language learning. It has to do with political trends, and or should I say, it has to do with what's hip, right? And it disturbed me, especially as I saw that grammar translation was completely dismissed. And it was associated with translating old texts. And I thought to myself, this is probably because that's how British people were, they studied Latin that way. And Latin, of course, is an extinct language. You never use it for conversation. But that is not to say that you cannot use the same method with conversational English, for instance. And so I know plenty of people who've become fluent, who have used translation. A friend of mine, his name is Mr. Ekström, who works for Bridgehead Consulting, informed me that Thais actually learn Japanese very well, and that when they learn Japanese, they're using grammar and translation in their classes, much like Swedish people use to learn English, and much like I used grammar and translation to learn French. And so, by dismissing this, I'm not saying you should do only grammar translation. I'm not saying the training should not be situational. I'm saying they're not mutually exclusive. And there's no real good reason for throwing away a tool from your toolbox. Students learn things in different ways, and one teacher might have great success with one student and not with another. This has to do with student motivation, which is tricky, but also in that some people just learn skills in different manners, in different ways. So, for me, the perfect teacher of any language, if I'm just looking at not the personalities, sort of the abstract, is someone who grew up speaking the same language as a student and has learned the target language to perfection. So for instance, a Thai who has learned English very, very, very well is, I would assume, a better teacher of English to a Thai than an English person who doesn't speak any Thai and has never learned another language in his or her life. And this would come across as very controversial to English teachers, who travel all over the world without speaking the language of the students, who have textbooks that never incorporate the local language. They're all written in English. And of course, there's a huge industrial bias behind that. If you're required to speak the student's language, at least for beginner students, then a lot of native speakers would be automatically disqualified instead of qualified for the jobs they hold. And therefore, you could say it's in their own self-interest to maintain the myth that a teacher does not need to understand the language of their students in order to be able to teach. That's all for me today. I hope you find the best teacher possible for you. And remember That teacher does not need to be a native speaker of English. In Thailand, I'd say the people who speak perfect English who are Thais have usually gone to very expensive schools, and they usually go on to very well-paying jobs. So they might not be interested in teaching English. And for that reason, native speakers might be the best option. However, if you do find a native speaker, try to find someone who has also learned a foreign language. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.